Pay attention to this booking image. 3 angles, front, left profile, right profile, of a suspect who looks like he should be in a high school classroom. Look at his face. Look at how young he appears. The booking officer who processed him that night actually paused the procedure twice to ask whether a guardian had been notified. Now look closer. Look past the face. Look at the arms. The tattoos covering both shoulders and running down to his wrists aren't the impulsive ink of a teenager. They're years of deliberate, layered artwork that takes time and money and a certain settled sense of permanence to accumulate. Look at the number on that booking board. 00145897. That number represents 11 prior arrests across 3 states. Now, here's the question that haunted every detective who ever looked at this image. How does a man with 11 prior arrests keep walking free? The answer to that question is the most unsettling part of this entire story, because the answer is standing right there in that image, holding that booking board, looking exactly like someone nobody would ever believe was the most dangerous person in the room. You know that feeling when you assume you know exactly what you're looking at? When your brain processes an image so fast, so automatically, that you never stop to question whether what you're seeing is actually what's there. We all do it. It's how human perception works. We build shortcuts, categories. We see a face that looks young, and we assign it youth. We see a small frame, and we assign it harmlessness. Develin Ross spent 9 years turning that cognitive shortcut into a criminal empire. Let me tell you about Kellerton, a mid-sized city in the inland southeast that most people outside the region have never heard of. Population just under 200,000. A city with decent neighborhoods and struggling ones, with a strong church community and a stubborn poverty problem and the particular mix of ambition and frustration that characterizes cities of its size and history. Kellerton had a drug problem. Not unique to Kellerton, most cities its size did. But Kellerton's drug problem had, over the course of nearly a decade, become unusually organized, unusually efficient, unusually difficult for law enforcement to penetrate or disrupt. Supply arrived reliably. Distribution was structured. Disputes were resolved quickly and quietly. The whole operation ran with a discipline that Detective Yvonne Quarles of the Kellerton PD's Organized Crime Unit described in a 2019 interview as almost corporate. At the top of that corporation, giving orders that moved through layers of intermediaries before reaching anyone who actually touched product or money, was a 31-year-old man who looked 17. And before we get to Develin, we need to talk about Wendell Price, because Wendell is where this story truly starts. Wendell is the reason any of this came to light at all. Wendell Price was 47 years old. He was a certified public accountant who'd been practicing in Kellerton for 19 years. He had a small but well-regarded firm on the 4th floor of a downtown office building, a wife named Loretta who taught elementary school, and 2 daughters in college. People who knew him described him as quiet, careful, detail-oriented. A man who was genuinely good at his job and who'd built a comfortable, respectable life through competence and discipline. He was also, for 7 years, Develin Ross's money laundering operation, and Wendell Price made one catastrophic mistake that got him killed. To understand what happened to Wendell Price, you have to understand how Develin Ross built the Venom Street Collective from nothing. Develin was born in Kellerton in 1987, the youngest of 3 children raised by a single mother in the city's Eastwick neighborhood, an area that had seen better decades. His mother, a woman named Gloria, worked 2 jobs and kept the household together through sheer force of will. By every account, she was a good mother in impossible circumstances, working constantly, fighting for her kids, trying to keep them pointed towards something better than what the neighborhood offered. Gloria had one particular worry that she expressed to teachers, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen, that Develin's size would make him a target. He'd been small his whole life, significantly smaller than other kids his age, the result of a growth hormone condition diagnosed when he was 8 that his mother couldn't afford to treat consistently. By the time he was in his early teens, he'd stopped growing at around 5 feet 1 inch. The kids at school were merciless. the way kids can be when they find a difference to exploit. Develin got into fights constantly in his first 2 years of middle school, not because he was aggressive by nature, but because other kids kept testing him, kept assuming that small meant weak, kept learning the same lesson the hard way that adults would spend the next 2 decades failing to learn. What Gloria hadn't anticipated, what nobody had anticipated, was that Develin's response to being small wouldn't be vulnerability. It would be strategy. He understood from an early age that his appearance created a consistent set of assumptions in other people's minds. Adults underestimated him. Authority figures didn't take him seriously. People who should have been watching him weren't because he didn't look like what they were watching for. He started using that at 13. Small things at first, running errands for older crew members in Eastwick who thought he was useful because nobody paid attention to a kid who looked 11, passing messages, carrying packages through checkpoints that would have caught anyone older, building a reputation, quietly, carefully, as someone reliable and invisible in a world where those two qualities together were worth more than almost anything else. By the time he was 17, Develin was running his own small operation. By 22, he'd founded the Venom Street Collective. The name was deliberate, Venom, something small that could kill you before you realized you'd been bitten. He told the founding members of the collective, 6 men he'd known since childhood, all of them from Eastwick, all of them with the particular loyalty that comes from shared history and shared struggle, that the organization would operate on 3 principles: patience, invisibility, and discipline. Anyone who violated any of those 3 principles was out. No exceptions, no second chances. That sounds simple. Criminal organizations always sound simple when you describe their principles. What made Develin's different was the consistency with which he enforced them. Over 9 years, 6 founding members became 3 because 2 had been caught acting without authorization, and 1 had developed a substance abuse problem that compromised his judgment. All 3 removals happened cleanly. No violence, no drama. The removed members simply found themselves gradually cut off from the network, their access reduced and then eliminated, until one day they realized they weren't in the organization anymore. Develin didn't need to be violent to maintain discipline. He needed people to understand that the organization functioned on his terms, and that there was no version of the organization that functioned on any other terms. That understanding was the discipline. The organizational structure he built was unlike anything Kellerton law enforcement had encountered before. There was no single visible leader who could be arrested and leave the operation headless. There were no meetings where everyone gathered in one place. There were layers. Distribution managers who didn't know the names of their suppliers, suppliers who communicated only through intermediaries, money moving through legitimate businesses with no visible connection to street-level operations. And at the very center of the financial architecture, handling the accounts, structuring the transactions, making the money disappear into legitimacy, was Wendell Price. Nobody has ever fully established how Develin recruited Wendell. The most credible theory, based on financial records examined during the investigation, is that Develin had identified Wendell's firm as handling accounts for several Eastwick business owners connected to Venom Street Collective activities, and had used that existing relationship as leverage, not a threat exactly, more a recognition. Wendell already knew where some of the money came from. Develin simply made the arrangement explicit and substantially more profitable. For 7 years, the arrangement worked perfectly. Wendell was good at his job. The money flowed cleanly. The collective's finances stayed invisible. Develin expanded into 3 additional states: Nashville, Birmingham, and Memphis, using the same structural model he'd built in Kellerton. And then Wendell got greedy. It started small, the way these things always do. A slight mischaracterization here, an undeclared deposit there, amounts small enough that a casual review wouldn't catch them. Wendell had been living with the stress of what he was doing for 7 years, and somewhere along the line he'd apparently decided that the stress deserved better compensation than he was receiving. He'd been doing the work of someone who knew their employer would kill them if they made a mistake, and getting paid like someone who processed standard corporate accounts. That calculation had been festering for years, and somewhere in 2019, based on the financial record timeline reconstructed by investigators, Wendell had started skimming. By early 2020, the amounts weren't small anymore. In March of 2020, Wendell made a transfer of $900,000 into an account that had no connection to any structure Develin recognized. A private account, apparently Wendell's exit fund. His plan to disappear. Loretta later told investigators that Wendell had been researching property in Portugal and Costa Rica in the months before his death. She'd thought it was a retirement fantasy. It was an escape route. Develin's financial oversight was meticulous. He didn't catch the skimming immediately. Wendell had hidden it well, spreading the small thefts across dozens of accounts over months. But he caught the $900,000 transfer within 3 weeks, and when he did, the decision he made was immediate and completely unemotional. On August 14, 2020, Wendell Price was found in the parking garage beneath his downtown office building, 22 stab wounds, his laptop beside him, untouched, his briefcase, containing client documents worth far more than any robbery would have yielded, also untouched. His wallet with $400 in cash still in his inside jacket pocket. The message was clear to anyone who knew how to read it. This wasn't robbery. This was consequence. Loretta Price received the call at 7:43 in the morning. She'd been expecting Wendell home from a late client meeting the night before and had assumed he'd decided to stay in the city rather than drive home after dark. She later told investigators that she'd been irritated when he hadn't called, that her last feeling toward her husband before she found out he was gone had been mild annoyance. She has said in interviews since that she still struggles with that, the weight of the last emotion you felt towards someone before you lost them. There's no way to resolve that. There's no place to put it that makes it feel less heavy. The Kellerton Police Department's Homicide Division took the case. The lead detective was a 17-year veteran named Floyd Obenhouse, a methodical, thorough investigator who'd cleared 43 of his last 50 homicide cases and who approached the Price murder the same way he approached everything, systematically, starting with the victim's life and working outward. What Floyd found when he started looking at Wendell Price's financial life stopped him cold. The shell companies, the layered accounts, the real estate transactions that didn't correspond to any property Wendell or his firm legitimately managed. A financial structure of considerable sophistication built around the fundamental goal of making large amounts of money look like it came from somewhere it didn't. Floyd knew immediately he was looking at a money laundering operation. What he didn't immediately know was whose. He called in the Organized Crime Unit. Detective Yvonne Quarles was assigned to support the investigation on October 2, 2020, 7 weeks after Wendell's murder. Quarles had been working organized crime in Kellerton for 6 years and knew the landscape of the city's criminal infrastructure better than almost anyone in the department. She looked at the financial structure Floyd had uncovered and recognized the architecture. Not the specific companies, those were new to her, but the design principles, the layering, the legitimate business fronts, the geographic spread, the discipline. "This is Venom Street collective money," she told Floyd at their first joint meeting. "I've been trying to get inside this organization for 3 years. This is the first time I've seen the financial layer." Floyd asked her who ran the collective. Quarles told him what she knew: a street name, Shorty King, and a physical description that matched nothing in any of the department's existing organized crime files, because nobody had ever successfully put a legal name to the alias. 3 years of working the collective, and she'd never gotten close to identifying the person at the top. Informants clammed up the moment she pushed toward leadership. Witnesses evaporated. The organization protected its leadership with an absolute consistency that Quarles had never seen matched. They didn't know yet that Develin Ross had been sitting in their police department twice asking them questions. Let's go back to that, because it's important. It's actually central to understanding how Develin operated and how long he'd been doing it successfully. The first visit had been in February of 2019, over a year before Wendell's murder. Develin had walked into the Kellerton PD's Community Relations Office, a public-facing function designed to maintain engagement with neighborhood residents, and presented himself as a concerned young person from the Eastwick area, worried about gang violence near his family's home. The officer who met with him that day was a community liaison named Dennis Fowler. Fowler had no reason to be suspicious of a young-looking man expressing concern about gang violence in his neighborhood. That was exactly the kind of engagement the Community Relations Office existed to facilitate. Fowler spent 40 minutes with Develin, describing the department's current enforcement priorities in Eastwick, which organizations they were actively targeting, what operations were in progress. Develin asked thoughtful questions, expressed appropriate concern about younger kids in the neighborhood getting drawn into gang activity, asked what signs a community member should watch for, thanked Fowler sincerely, and left. He'd walked out with more operational intelligence about the investigation into Venom Street collective activities than any of his network's informants had been able to provide in months. He'd identified 2 active surveillance operations, the names of 3 detectives assigned to organized crime work in Eastwick, and the general timeline of an enforcement sweep being planned for spring. The sweep was adjusted before it happened. 2 members of the collective who would have been caught in it were quietly moved to different areas of operation. When the sweep occurred, it netted minor players and achieved nothing of significance. The second visit was in November of 2019, 9 months later. This time he went to a different office, the Crime Prevention Unit, which held public meetings about drug activity in specific neighborhoods. Develin attended one such meeting as a member of the public, sitting in the back row, listening carefully as officers described enforcement challenges and community resources. Afterward, he approached the presenting officer, a sergeant named Bridget Tanaka, with questions about the specific areas of Eastwick where enforcement was being concentrated. Sergeant Tanaka later told investigators that she remembered the young man clearly. "He seemed really engaged," she said, "really concerned about his community. I thought it was great to see a young person taking that kind of interest." She paused for a moment before continuing. "I told him everything he asked about. I thought I was doing my job, connecting with the community, building trust." She looked away from the investigator during that part of her account. "I thought I was building trust," she said again. He was taking inventory. After Quarles identified the Venom Street collective connection to Wendell's murder, she and Floyd spent 3 months trying to connect a real identity to the Shorty King alias. Every source they cultivated dried up. Every witness they approached suddenly couldn't remember anything useful. Every informant they reached out to either had nothing or developed selective amnesia about anything related to collective leadership. The wall wasn't unusual. The collective had maintained it for 9 years. But the consistency of it, the absolute, impenetrable silence around Develin's identity, told investigators something important. This wasn't the ordinary code of silence that characterized street-level gang culture. This was something more deliberate, more cultivated. An organization whose members had been trained from the beginning to protect one specific piece of information above everything else. Who was Shorty King? What they needed was someone on the inside who had a reason to talk, and finding that person, it turned out, was going to take another year. Through early 2021, Floyd and Quarles continued building their case against whoever had ordered Wendell Price's murder. They'd assembled substantial financial evidence connecting the shell companies in Wendell's books to the Venom Street Collective's operational accounts. They'd documented the layering system. They'd mapped the geographic spread of the organization across 4 states. They had a clear picture of the what. They still didn't have the who. More precisely, they had a who, Shorty King, but no legal identity attached to it. Quarles tried a different approach in the spring of 2021. Instead of working from the top down, trying to identify the leadership and build down, she started working from the bottom up. Street-level arrests, minor players, people facing charges that could be reduced in exchange for information. She conducted 14 such conversations between March and October of 2021. 13 produced nothing useful on the question of collective leadership. The 14th produced a name. Not a full name, not yet, just a first name, Develin, and a neighborhood, Eastwick. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was the first crack in the wall. She ran every Develin in the Eastwick area through the system, got 11 results, cross-referenced with the physical description she had for Shorty King. Small frame, young-looking, heavily tattooed. Narrowed it to 3 possibilities. Then she ran those 3 through the prior arrest database for other states and got something that looked like a near match. A Devin Riley, arrested in Nashville in 2015, small frame, tattoos consistent with description, charges dismissed after witnesses recanted. Devin Riley's social security number didn't match any existing person in the national database, a classic indicator of a false alias constructed for a specific arrest. She filed a request with the FBI's Organized Crime Division to cross-reference Devin Riley's biometric data with any other entries in the national system. The request sat in a queue for 6 weeks before being processed. When it came back, it contained a match to a booking photograph from a 2012 Kellerton arrest under yet another alias, Damon Reyes. Damon Reyes's fingerprints were in the system, and Damon Reyes's fingerprints matched a sealed juvenile record from 2003. A Kellerton juvenile named Develin Antoine Ross. Quarles had a name, a real name. For the first time in 3 years of working the collective, she had a real name. She ran it through everything. Prior arrests, 11, as the booking footage would later show, across 3 states under 4 different aliases. Each time, charges had been reduced or dismissed. Each time, the case notes contained some variation of the same procedural anomaly. Questions about the suspect's age, delays in processing, softening of approach. She pulled the most recent booking photograph available, from a 2017 arrest in Birmingham that had been resolved through a plea deal for a misdemeanor. She showed it to Floyd. Floyd looked at it for a long time. "How old is he?" he asked. 30, she said. "At the time of that photograph." Floyd looked at the photograph again. "He looks 15, he said. "Yes," Quarles said. "He does." She understood then, completely and with cold clarity, how 9 years had gone by. How 11 arrests had resulted in nothing. She'd been doing this job for 6 years, and her first instinct looking at that photograph was the same instinct every booking officer, every arresting detective, every prosecutor had had. The face told a story that the facts didn't support, and every single person who'd encountered Develin Ross had trusted the face. On December 9th, 2021, 16 months after Wendell Price's murder, 3 months after, Quarles first got the name Develin. A Kellerton PD patrol unit arrested a man named Orville Tate on weapons charges. Tate had been stopped for a routine traffic violation, and the officer had found a loaded firearm in the glove compartment. Tate had 2 prior felony convictions. The firearm charge was his 3rd strike under state sentencing guidelines. 3rd strike meant mandatory life imprisonment. Orville Tate was 36 years old. He'd been in the Venom Street Collective for 7 years, serving as a distribution manager for the Kellerton Southside operation. Not leadership level, but senior enough to have attended meetings where Develin was present, to know the organizational structure, to have direct knowledge of operations and decisions made at the top. He spent 6 hours in consultation with his attorney before making a decision. He told the attorney, "I need to talk to someone about Shorty King." Quarles and Floyd were called in that evening. They sat across from Orville Tate in interview room 3 and spent the next 4 hours taking a statement that Floyd later described as the most comprehensive account of a criminal organization he'd heard in 17 years. Tate talked about everything: the structure of the collective across all 4 states, the distribution networks, the supply chains connecting Kellerton to sources in Atlanta and Miami, the shell companies and the money laundering operation through Wendell Price's accounting firm, the decision-making process, how orders came down from Develin through a single trusted intermediary to each regional manager, ensuring that almost nobody in the organization ever had direct contact with the man at the top. He described the way new members were inducted, a probationary period of 6 months where they worked only the most basic street-level operations, with no exposure to organizational structure above their immediate supervisor. A period designed to allow assessment of judgment, reliability, and most importantly, discretion before any sensitive information was shared. He described the financial rewards available to members who performed reliably, not just money but access, advancement, the particular status that came from being trusted by an organization that trusted almost nobody. He described the fear that kept people silent, not threats, not explicit violence, but the understood certainty that disloyalty had consequences. And then he talked about Wendell Price. Word had come down through the network in the spring of 2020 that there was a financial problem requiring resolution. Nobody below a certain level had known the specifics. What Tate knew was that 2 weeks after that message circulated, Wendell Price was dead. He identified the man who'd carried out the killing as a collective enforcer named Reginald Stubbs, known inside the organization as Reggie. Stubbs had been the collective's primary enforcer for 4 years, responsible for what Tate called consequence delivery. And then Tate told them something that made both investigators stop writing for a full 5 seconds. He told them about the police department visits. Not one, both of them, in detail. Tate had heard about the visits from Develin himself. Develin had considered them his most satisfying operational achievements and had described them to senior collective members as demonstrations of his core philosophy. The best intelligence comes from the source, and the source never expects you to walk in the front door and ask. Quarles and Floyd looked at each other across the interview table. Then Floyd asked Tate if he could identify Develin Ross by name and description and tell them where to find him. Tate said yes. He said he could tell them where Develin would be on the following Tuesday evening, because Develin had a standing arrangement that Tate knew about from having been responsible for ensuring the route was clear on 3 separate occasions. Every second Tuesday, Develin had dinner at a small restaurant in Kellerton's Northside neighborhood, a family-owned Italian place called Carmelo's. He always arrived at 7:30, always sat at the same corner table, always had the same server, a woman who had no idea who her regular customer actually was, always ordered the same 3 things, always stayed exactly 90 minutes. The routine was Develin's one consistent vulnerability, and in 9 years of extraordinary operational discipline, it was one of the only personal vulnerabilities he'd allowed himself. He'd apparently told a trusted associate once that a man needed one normal thing in his life, one thing that was just about being a person rather than running an organization. Carmelo's was his one normal thing. The routine would be what brought him down. Floyd and Quarles requested surveillance authorization that same night. By the following Monday, they had it. On Tuesday, December 16th, 2021, 7 days after Orville Tate's arrest, Detective Quarles sat in an unmarked vehicle on the street outside Carmelo's restaurant at 7:15 p.m. and watched the sidewalk. Floyd was inside the restaurant at a table near the entrance, pretending to review a menu, positioned where he could see both the front door and the corner table. At 7:31 p.m., a vehicle pulled up across the street. A small figure in a dark jacket stepped out, looked up and down the block once in a single practice sweep, and walked through the front door. Quarles radioed Floyd. "He's here. And Floyd, he looks like a kid." Floyd confirmed visually. He watched Develin cross the restaurant, exchange a brief warm greeting with the server who clearly knew him, and settle into the corner table with the ease of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. He wrote the description in his notes, then added beneath it, "Booking photo is going to require a lot of explanation." They didn't arrest Develin that night. They watched him, documented his arrival, his behavior, 2 phone calls he made during the meal, the vehicle that picked him up at 9:02 p.m., 90 minutes after he'd arrived, almost to the minute. They ran the license plate of the pickup vehicle, registered to a shell company that traced, after 2 weeks of financial analysis, to an account connected to the Venom Street Collective's Birmingham operation. Combined with the biometric chain from the fingerprints, they now had a positive identification. The man eating pasta at Carmelo's every second Tuesday was Develin Antoine Ross, founding leader of the Venom Street Collective, the man who'd ordered Wendell Price's death and, according to Orville Tate, 12 other murders before it. The full arrest and search warrant application was filed on January 14, 2022, and approved 2 days later. The warrant covered Develin Ross personally, 3 residential addresses associated with him through financial records, a storage facility in Kellerton's warehouse district, and the records of 6 shell companies identified through the Price investigation. The arrest was planned for February 3, 2022, chosen because surveillance had established that Develin spent Wednesday mornings at a gym in Northside, another routine, another small vulnerability in an otherwise nearly impenetrable operational structure. At 8:14 a.m. on February 3, 2022, Detective Quarles, Detective Floyd, and 6 additional officers entered the gym. They found Develin in the middle of a workout, alone with a personal trainer who had absolutely no idea who his client was. Develin saw them coming from across the room, made eye contact with Quarles, held it for a moment. He didn't run, didn't reach for anything, didn't react with anger or panic or any of the things people do when they've been caught and they know it. He put down the weights he'd been holding, walked toward the approaching officers, and held out his wrists. "You took long enough," he said. The booking process at Kellerton PD took 3 hours, partly because 2 different officers during the intake procedure asked whether someone had contacted his parents. Each time, Quarles had to explain that the suspect was 34 years old. Both officers looked at the face in front of them and back at Quarles with the particular expression of people who are being told something their instincts are refusing to accept. That expression, Quarles thought, was the entire case in miniature. The booking photograph taken that morning went out on the department's press release that afternoon. By the following morning, it had been picked up by national outlets. By afternoon, it was everywhere. The 3-angle booking shot of a man who looked like a teenager, holding a booking board that said 00145897, with a face that made millions of people across the country do exactly what every officer who'd ever processed Develin Ross had done: assume, react, misread. The phone calls to the department started almost immediately. People who'd seen the booking photo and assumed it was a mistake. Journalists asking whether the suspect was actually a juvenile. Members of the public expressing concern about what appeared to be a minor being processed through the adult criminal system. Quarles fielded 17 such calls personally before noon. To each of them, she said the same thing. He is 34 years old. He is the founding leader of a criminal organization responsible for at least 13 murders, and he has been exploiting exactly the reaction you just had for 9 years. The searches conducted simultaneously with Develin's arrest on February 3, 2022, produced evidence that transformed the case from strong to overwhelming. At the Northside residential address, a modest house registered to one of the shell companies, investigators found financial records going back 7 years. Handwritten ledgers, encrypted hard drives, and a filing system of considerable sophistication documenting the collective's operations in extraordinary detail. Everything organized, everything dated, everything cross-referenced. It was the kind of meticulous record-keeping you'd expect from a very careful accountant. The irony of that, given Wendell Price's fate, was not lost on anyone. The storage facility in the warehouse district contained additional financial records and, critically, 2 burner phones in a sealed bag. Digital forensics analysis of those phones, completed over the following 3 weeks, revealed a communication record spanning 14 months. The phones had been used to send instructions, in a coded system that took investigators 2 weeks to crack, to 6 different numbers associated with collective operations across the 4-state network. The coding system, when cracked, turned out to be elegant in its simplicity. It used a rotating key based on dates that only Develin and his senior intermediaries knew, a system that looked like random text to anyone who didn't have the key, but decoded cleanly into specific operational instructions when the correct date-based algorithm was applied. One of those coded communications, dated August 11th, 2020, 3 days before Wendell. Price's murder, read when decrypted, financial problem confirmed. Reggie handles, clean by Friday. August 11th to August 14th, 3 days. Wendell Price was dead on the Friday. The message from the phone, the murder. The timeline connecting them was precise and undeniable. Reginald Stubbs was arrested on February 17, 2022, 2 weeks after Develin, at his apartment in Birmingham, Alabama. He was found in possession of physical evidence connecting him to 3 separate homicides, including tools and materials consistent with the method of Wendell Price's killing. DNA evidence subsequently confirmed his presence at the parking garage scene. Stubbs chose cooperation. His testimony confirmed Tate's account of the Price murder authorization and added specific details about 12 additional killings carried out on Develin's orders between 2014 and 2021. He described the manner in which orders were communicated, always through a single intermediary, always in coded language, always with enough structural distance between Develin and the act itself that no direct connection should have been traceable. Should have been. Wasn't. Because of a burner phone kept in a sealed bag in a warehouse storage unit. 13 murders, total, 9 years. Each one authorized by a man who looked like he should be worried about college applications. But here's the piece that brought everything full circle. The piece that connected the pre-intro booking footage to the center of the investigation and made the trial's most powerful moment possible. During the search of the Northside house, investigators found a folder in the filing system labeled simply PD. Inside were notes, handwritten in Develin's precise, small script, from the 2 community relations visits he'd made to Kellerton Police Department headquarters. Both visits documented, both dated, both containing meticulous notes on the information he'd extracted from Dennis Fowler in February of 2019 and Sergeant Bridget Tanaka in November of 2019. Names of operations, geographic focus areas, resource allocation, specific cases the department was prioritizing, the planned timeline of the spring 2020 enforcement sweep that had been adjusted after his first visit. He had walked in through the front door of the police department twice and walked out with briefing documents on their own operations, written in his own hand, filed in his own record system, dated and organized with the same thoroughness he applied to everything else. Reading those notes, Floyd later said, was one of the strangest experiences of his investigative career. It was like reading our own intelligence reports, he said, except they were written by the person we were investigating. He knew things about our operations that some of our own officers didn't know, and he got them by looking young and asking politely. The case was assigned to Assistant District Attorney Philippa Dorsett, an experienced prosecutor who'd handled organized crime cases for 11 years. Dorsett reviewed the evidence over 3 weeks and told her supervisor it was the most thoroughly documented organized crime case she'd seen since joining the office. Develin's defense was led by a highly regarded criminal defense attorney named Augustine Farrow, who had spent 25 years defending clients in complex, organized crime cases. Farrow challenged the credibility of Tate and Stubbs as cooperating witnesses with obvious incentives to fabricate. He challenged the interpretation of the coded phone communications, arguing the prosecution's decryption methodology was unverified. He challenged the chain of custody on the financial records. He was skilled and thorough, and his challenges were legitimate. They weren't enough, because the case Quarles and Floyd had built didn't rest on any single piece. It was a structure, interconnected, mutually corroborating, with every thread reinforcing every other thread. And then Dorsett played the booking footage. The jury watched the 3-angle booking record from February 3rd, 2022. Front view, left profile, right profile. Heard Dorsett describe in detail what each officer who'd processed that booking had done, the calls to juvenile services, the questions about parents, the systematic softening of approach by people whose instincts told them they were looking at a teenager. Then she played it again, and while it played, she read aloud from the prior arrest records. 11 arrests. The same pattern repeated across 11 different encounters in 3 different states over 9 years. 11 times the system had looked at Develin Ross and made an assumption it shouldn't have made. 11 times those assumptions had contributed to his freedom. She let the jury sit with that for a moment, a full, uninterrupted minute of silence while they looked at the booking footage. Then she put up the PD folder notes, the intelligence briefings Develin had produced from his 2 visits to headquarters, his own handwriting documenting exactly what he'd learned and how he'd obtained it. "This man," Dorsett told the jury, "understood your instincts better than you understand them yourselves. He knew what you would assume when you looked at him. He built a criminal organization on that assumption. He walked into a police station, twice, and proved that the assumption could be weaponized against the very people whose job it was to see through it." She paused. "Let that land. Look at him now. Look at him the way the booking officers looked at him. And then look at the evidence. And then tell me which one is real." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On the 4th day, they returned 19 guilty verdicts, every count. When the verdict was read, Develin Ross sat very still. His expression didn't shift. His eyes moved slowly around the courtroom, taking inventory, the way he always had, the way he'd been doing since he was 13 years old in Eastwick, and figured out that careful observation was the most powerful tool available to someone in his position. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Develin stood, adjusted his jacket, looked at the judge directly. "I built something real," he said. Quiet voice. Perfect carry in the silent courtroom. "You're not convicting a kid. You're convicting the most careful man in this room." The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. The courtroom sketch from that day, a small figure in a large suit at a large table, surrounded by attorneys and officers and the full machinery of the criminal justice system, was reproduced in newspapers across the country. Millions of people looked at that sketch and had the same instinctive reaction, the same one everyone always had. The dissonance between how Develin looked and what he'd actually done was the story. It always had been. In the years since Develin Ross's conviction, the Kellerton Police Department has undergone a comprehensive review of its community relations procedures, specifically focused on how information is shared in public-facing contexts. New protocols require that any individual seeking operational information about active investigations be verified through the department's record system before substantive engagement occurs. Community liaison officers receive additional training on the distinction between genuine community engagement and operational disclosure. The review also produced something broader, a departmental training program called Assumption Audit, developed in collaboration with a behavioral psychology consultant from a state university, designed to help officers identify and interrogate their own automatic assumptions during encounters. The program has been adopted by 4 other law enforcement agencies in the state since its introduction. It uses Develin Ross's booking footage as its opening case study. There's something uncomfortable about a criminal's greatest tool becoming a law enforcement training aid, but Quarles, who contributed to developing the program, has said she thinks Develin would find it fitting. "He always believed knowledge came from whatever source was available," she said. "He'd probably appreciate being educational." Detective Sergeant Bridget Tanaka, who'd spoken to Develin at the November 2019 crime prevention meeting, requested a transfer to the organized crime unit following the conviction. She was approved and joined Quarles' team in early 2023. She has since led 2 successful organized crime investigations. In an interview, she said, "I spent 2 years thinking about that conversation, about what I said and what it cost. I couldn't undo it, but I could spend the rest of my career making sure I understood exactly how it happened so it didn't happen again." Dennis Fowler, the community liaison officer who'd spent 40 minutes briefing Develin in February 2019, retired early from the department in mid-2022. He declined all interview requests and has not spoken publicly about the case. His colleagues described him as a good officer who did what seemed right at the time and has struggled significantly with the consequences of it. Orville Tate received a substantially reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. His weapons charge was resolved through a plea that resulted in 3 years rather than life. He was released in early 2024 and relocated. Whether his cooperation represented genuine remorse or simple self-preservation is something only Tate can answer. The families of the 13 murder victims have their own answers about what they think it represented. Reginald Stubbs pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and received 3 consecutive life sentences. His cooperation with the prosecution was considered in the sentencing recommendation, but produced no reduction below life imprisonment. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, said that the nature and number of the killings attributed to Stubbs precluded any sentence that left open the possibility of his eventual release. Loretta Price gave a victim impact statement at Develin's sentencing that lasted 11 minutes. She spoke about her husband, about who he'd been before he'd made the choices that placed him inside the Venom Street Collective's financial operation, about the daughters who'd grown up and finished college and started their lives while their father's murder investigation dragged on for 16 months, about the particular cruelty of learning that the person you loved had been living a double life you never suspected. She was honest about Wendell's role. She didn't excuse it. She said she'd spent 2 years coming to terms with the fact that her husband had made choices that were wrong, that had hurt people, that had contributed to the criminal operation that ultimately ordered his death. But she said something near the end that stayed with everyone in the courtroom. "He was my husband for 23 years. Whatever else he was my husband. He coached our daughter's soccer teams. He made dinner on Sunday nights. He had a way of laughing at his own jokes before he finished telling them that drove me crazy for 20 years. I want whoever made the decision to kill him to understand that there was a person in that parking garage. A real person. A person with a family who loved him and who has to keep living in the world that he left behind." She looked directly at Develin when she said it. Develin looked back at her without expression. After the sentencing was over, one of the daughters, the younger one, 23 years old, who'd come to every day of the trial like her mother, waited in the hallway outside the courtroom. A reporter asked her if she felt the verdict brought closure. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "I feel like something is finished. I don't know if closure is the right word for it. My father made choices. A man in a suit made a decision. And I grew up without my dad. That's just the truth of it. No verdict changes what the truth is." The Venom Street Collective as a functioning organization collapsed within 18 months of Develin's arrest. Without the central intelligence and decision-making authority he provided, regional operations fractured into competing factions. Disputes that had been resolved through his calm, patient arbitration became violent conflicts. 3 chapter leaders were killed in internecine violence between March 2022 and August 2023. Federal and state prosecutors used the organizational chaos to pursue charges against 16 additional collective members across the 4-state network. 11 of those cases resulted in convictions. Detective Floyd retired in December 2023, having cleared 49 of his last 60 homicide cases. He declined specific interview requests about the Price case, but at his retirement gathering said one thing that colleagues quoted back to each other afterward. "The hardest cases aren't the ones where you don't have enough evidence. They're the ones where you've been looking at the answer the whole time, and the answer looks like something else." Detective Quarles was promoted to lieutenant and now leads the Kellerton PD's organized crime unit. She has spoken at 3 law enforcement conferences about the case, each time showing the booking footage as her opening image and asking the audience what they see. The answers are always the same. Everyone sees a kid. "That's the point," she says. "That's exactly the point. And until we train ourselves out of that reflex, until we learn to separate what we're seeing from what we're assuming, someone else will use it the same way he did." Develin Antoine Ross was convicted of 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 4 counts of murder for hire, continuing criminal enterprise, 9 counts of narcotics distribution conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. 19 counts in total. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, and is currently serving his sentence at a maximum security state correctional facility, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. He has filed one appeal. It was denied. Wendell Price was 47 years old. He made choices that placed him inside a world that ultimately killed him, and there's no honest way to tell his story without acknowledging that. But his daughter's words outside the courtroom stay with you. Her father made choices. A man in a suit made a decision. And a family has to keep living in a world that changed forever on August 14th, 2020. Wendell Price deserved better choices than the ones he made. His daughters deserved a father who came home. Loretta deserved a husband who could tell her the truth about his life. None of them got what they deserved. That's the part that stays with you long after the verdicts are read and the sentences are handed down and the booking footage becomes a training tool and the case files are finally closed. The system caught Develin Ross eventually. Floyd and Quarles were thorough and determined, and they got there. But getting there took 9 years and 13 deaths and a 17-year-old accountant's mistake and a lieutenant who decided to count on a routine dinner at an Italian restaurant. 9 years? 11 arrests? 13 murders? 2 visits to the police department where he asked questions and got answers and walked back out into the city to keep building the thing he'd been building since he was a kid in Eastwick who figured out that looking small wasn't a weakness if you decided to make it a weapon. Justice was served. Eventually. But justice served late is still late. And somewhere in those 9 years are 13 people who didn't get to see the verdict. Remember that.